Between 1979 and 1981, at least 29 black children, adolescents, and young adults were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. Only 2 of those cases ever went to trial. And the man convicted, Wayne Bertram Williams, was not convicted for killing a child. He was convicted for the deaths of 2 adult men. How does a city bury nearly 30 young people, name a single suspect, and then close more than 20 of those files based on a conviction that never mentioned any of them? The first real break in the case came from a splash under a bridge at 2 in the morning. And 40 years later, investigators are still arguing about what that splash actually proved. Tonight we walk through the timeline, the victims, the fiber evidence, the 2 suspects the FBI seriously considered, and the one detail the jury never got to hear in full. Detail number 3 is the one that still troubles former investigators today. If you follow cases like this, subscribe. Dark Cases covers a new one every week. To understand the case against Wayne Williams, you first have to understand the city that was terrified of him and the children whose names the trial never spoke aloud. Atlanta, Georgia, in the summer of 1979, was a city in transition. It had a black mayor, Maynard Jackson, a rising black professional class, and a large, poor, largely invisible population of black children living in public housing and along the edges of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. On July 28, 1979, a woman looking for cans in a wooded area off Niskey Lake Road found the body of 14-year-old Edward Hope Smith. Nearby lay the body of 13-year-old Alfred Evans. Edward had been shot. Alfred's cause of death was listed as probable asphyxiation. Both were black. Both had been missing for days. Neither death made front-page news. That silence is the first thing you have to sit with, because over the next 22 months, more children would disappear and more bodies would be found before anyone at the national level was willing to call it a pattern. Milton Harvey vanished in September 1979 while running an errand on his bicycle. He was 14. His body was found weeks later. In October, 9-year-old Yusuf Bell was sent to buy snuff for a neighbor. He never came home. His body was discovered in an abandoned school. He had been strangled. By the spring of 1980, mothers in Atlanta's housing projects were keeping their children indoors after dark. They were also, according to later testimony, calling police repeatedly and being told that their children had probably run away. One of those mothers, Camille Bell, Yusuf's mother, refused to accept that. Together with other parents, she formed the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. It was the parents, not the police, who first insisted publicly that these deaths were connected. By the summer of 1980, the pattern was undeniable. Angel Lanier, 12, found tied to a tree. Jeffrey Mathis, 10, disappeared going to buy cigarettes for his mother. Christopher Richardson, 11. LaTonya Wilson, 7, taken from her own bedroom. Aaron Witch, 10, found beneath a highway overpass. Anthony Carter, 9. Earl Terrell, 10. Clifford Jones, 13. Charles Stevens, 12. Aaron Jackson, 9. Patrick Rogers, 16. The list kept growing and the ages kept climbing until the victims included young men in their 20s: Larry Rogers, John Porter, Michael McIntosh, Nathaniel Cater, Jimmy Ray Payne. Most were strangled or asphyxiated. Some had been dumped in the Chattahoochee and South Rivers. By late 1980, the FBI had joined the investigation. President Jimmy Carter authorized federal funding. Vice President George H.W. Bush would later visit the city. Celebrities donated to reward funds. Frank Sinatra performed a benefit. And still, for months, there was no suspect. What there was a theory. FBI behavioral analysts, including John Douglas, profiled the killer as most likely a young black man in his 20s, familiar with Atlanta, someone the victims would not immediately fear. That profile mattered later. It mattered a great deal. By the spring of 1981, investigators had noticed something specific about the river dumps. Bodies pulled from the Chattahoochee were being found nude or nearly nude and increasingly free of the fibers, hairs, and debris that had linked earlier bodies. Someone, the theory went, had figured out that the police were using trace evidence. Someone was washing the bodies or dumping them in water to erase that evidence. So the police did something unusual. They set up stakeouts on the bridges over the Chattahoochee River. Which brings us to the night of May 22nd, 1981. Just after 2 in the morning, A rookie police recruit named Bob Campbell was stationed under the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. He heard a loud splash in the water below. Above, on the bridge, an officer stopped a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon. The driver was a 23-year-old black man named Wayne Williams. He was heavyset, bespectacled, soft-spoken. He described himself as a music promoter and a freelance photographer. He said he was on his way to audition a singer named Cheryl Johnson. When police tried to verify the phone number and address he provided, no such person existed. Williams was allowed to leave that night. He was not arrested, but he was now the center of the investigation. 2 days later, on May 24th, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater was pulled from the Chattahoochee, downstream from that bridge. He had been asphyxiated. Investigators believed he had been in the water for a short time, consistent with a body having entered the river around the time of that splash. Who was Wayne Williams? He was an only child, still living with his parents in a middle-class black neighborhood in northwest Atlanta. As a teenager, he had built a low-wattage radio station in his basement. He handed out business cards claiming to represent an aspiring pop group. Neighbors described him as odd, boastful, a young man who wanted very badly to be important. He had no prior violent record. He had been stopped twice before during the investigation and released. On June 21, 1981, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Nathaniel Cater. Later, a second charge was added, the murder of 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne, whose body had been pulled from the same river in April. Those were the only 2 cases that ever went to trial. Not one child. Not one of the more than 20 victims on what had become known as the list. And this is where the case against Wayne Williams becomes something more complicated than a courtroom verdict. The trial began in Atlanta in late 1981 and ran into early 1982. The prosecution had no eyewitness to either killing, no confession, no fingerprints of Williams on either body. What they had was fiber evidence and a theory of pattern. The fiber case was, at the time, one of the most ambitious in American forensic history. Analysts from the Georgia State Crime Lab and the FBI testified that fibers found on the bodies of Cater and Payne matched a very specific green trilobal carpet fiber used in the bedroom of Wayne Williams's home. That specific fiber, they testified, had been manufactured by the West Point Pepperell Company under the trade name Luxair in a color called English olive, for only a limited period between 1970 and 1971. Statistical estimates presented at trial suggested the odds of a random Atlanta household having that carpet were extremely low, on the order of 1 in several thousand. Additional matches were made to fibers from Williams's station wagon, from a bedspread, from a yellow blanket, and to dog hairs consistent with the family German Shepherd Sheba. The defense argued that fiber evidence of this type had never before been the sole basis of a murder conviction, that the statistical estimates were speculative, and that the samples had been handled in ways that could have introduced contamination. They pointed out that Williams was cooperative during his initial stop, that he had submitted to a polygraph, and that the polygraph results were disputed. And then the prosecution did something that changed the trial. Under Georgia law, they were allowed to introduce evidence of a pattern of similar crimes to prove identity, even for crimes for which the defendant was not charged. Over defense objections, the judge allowed testimony connecting Williams, through fiber and hair evidence, to 10 additional victims from the list, 10 children and young men whose deaths he was not on trial for. The jury heard about them anyway. On February 27, 1982, Wayne Williams was convicted of the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. He has maintained his innocence ever since. And here is the detail that still troubles former investigators today, the one promised at the start of this video. Within days of the conviction, the Atlanta Task Force administratively closed 22 of the remaining cases on the list, attributing them to Williams without a trial, without new evidence being presented in open court, and in several instances without notifying the victims' families in advance. Not solved. Closed. There is a difference, and every parent on that list understood the difference. Some of those cases remain officially closed to this day. Others were quietly reopened decades later. That is the part of the story the trial did not resolve. Because there is credible evidence, some of it developed by the FBI itself during the original investigation, that not all of the killings were committed by the same person. Declassified FBI files and later reporting revealed that agents had seriously investigated members of a Ku Klux Klan-affiliated family, the Sanderses, in connection with several of the killings. A Klan informant reported that one member had bragged about killing black children and had spoken of starting a race war. Wiretaps were placed. Grand jury materials were sealed. Georgia state investigators working separately reportedly concluded that they could not build a case, and the federal investigation into the Sanders family ended without charges. Those files remained sealed for decades. When portions were eventually reviewed by journalists and by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, they raised uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly that lead had been pursued once Wayne Williams was in custody. There's also the matter of the victims who do not fit the profile of a single killer. Angel Lanier was found bound. LaTonya Wilson was taken from inside her home. Some victims were shot, others were strangled, some were dumped in rivers, some were left in wooded lots. Behavioral analysts at the time noted that this range of methods, victim ages, and disposal sites was unusual for a single offender. John Douglas himself, the FBI profiler most associated with the case, has said publicly that he believes Williams was responsible for many of the killings, but not all of them, and that other perpetrators were almost certainly involved in at least some of the deaths on the list. That is a striking statement from the man whose profile helped build the case. In 2005, DeKalb County Police announced they were reopening 5 of the cases. In 2019, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Police Chief Erica Shields announced that all of the Atlanta child murders cases would be re-examined and that preserved evidence would be retested using modern DNA techniques unavailable in 1981. The families of victims had been requesting exactly that for nearly 4 decades. Some of that retesting has produced results. In 2010, hair evidence from one of the cases was subjected to mitochondrial DNA analysis. The results were consistent with Williams, though mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line and cannot uniquely identify an individual. In other cases, evidence has degraded, been lost, or been consumed by earlier testing. The 2019 review remains ongoing. As of the most recent public updates, no charges have been added to Williams's file, and none of the 22 administratively closed cases have been formally reopened as active homicide investigations against another suspect. Wayne Williams remains incarcerated in a Georgia state prison. He has filed appeals on the grounds that the fiber evidence has been re-evaluated by modern forensic standards, that the statistical claims made at trial would not survive current Daubert challenges, and that the pattern evidence introduction was prejudicial. Those appeals have been denied. He is now in his mid-60s. The families of the children on the list live with something harder than a verdict. They live with a case that was closed on their behalf without ever being tried on their behalf. Camille Bell, Yusuf's mother, spent the rest of her life insisting that her son's killer had never been named in a courtroom. Willie Mae Mathis, mother of Jeffrey, said the same. So did the mother of LaTonya Wilson. So did others, quietly, in interviews that rarely made national television. What we know for certain is this. Between 1979 and 1981, at least 29 young black people were murdered in and around Atlanta. Wayne Williams was convicted of killing 2 of them, both adults. The fiber evidence in those 2 cases was significant, though contested. The FBI seriously investigated at least one other group of suspects, and those files were sealed for decades. And more than 20 families were told without a trial that their children's cases were closed. What we do not know, and what 40 years of appeals, documentaries, retesting, and reinvestigations have failed to resolve, is how many of those 29 killings were the work of one man, and how many were the work of others who were never charged. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the public position of some of the investigators who built the original case. The children on that list had names: Edward, Alfred, Milton, Yusuf, Angel, Jeffrey, Christopher, LaTonya, Aaron, Anthony, Earl, Clifford, Charles, Patrick, and more. Every one of them was somebody's child. The verdict against Wayne Williams did not answer their cases. It only closed them. If this case stayed with you, remember the names, not just the suspect. Subscribe to Dark Cases for a new investigation every week, and if you want us to cover a specific unsolved file next, leave the case in the comments. Every mention helps us decide which story we tell next.